Hello everyone, thank you for being here. Hope you have a relaxing and comfortable time with Stories for Happy Life channel. The Los Angeles County Courthouse was alive with its usual morning energy. Lawyers flipping through case files, the rhythmic clacking of court stenographers at their machines, and the low hum of hushed conversations among the courtroom spectators. The scent of polished wood and freshly printed legal documents mixed with the stale aroma of coffee, filling the space with an air of seriousness. At the front of the courtroom, Judge William Harrington sat behind his towering oak desk, his fingers tapping lazily against the armrest. A seasoned judge with over 25 years on the bench, he had seen it all: liars, career criminals, and lost souls who never stood a chance. He glanced at the docket and sighed as the bailiff announced the next case. The State of California versus Malik Carter. Judge Harrington barely glanced up as a 19-year-old defendant was escorted into the courtroom, his hands cuffed in front of him. Dressed in an oversized beige jumpsuit, Malik stood with an air of quiet defiance, his chin lifted just enough to signal he wasn't afraid. Yet there was something unsettling about him. Not in a criminal sense, but in his posture, his gaze, his calmness in the face of the moment. Harrington adjusted his glasses and gave Malik a once-over. Another kid who thought he could beat the system. The judge had seen hundreds like him, and in his experience, most of them weren't smart enough to fight back. The prosecutor, Leonard Gates, an older man with silvering hair and a confident smirk, rose from his seat with the air of someone who already considered this case won. "Your Honor," Gates began, straightening his tie. The defendant, Malik Carter, was caught behind the wheel of a stolen vehicle. A brand new 2023 Lexus coupe reported missing from a parking lot in downtown Los Angeles. Officers pursued him for 3 blocks before detaining him. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel, and the prosecution submits that the evidence will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Malik Carter is guilty of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Judge Harrington barely reacted. Another stolen car? Another reckless teenager? Another easy conviction. Then he noticed something. The defendant's hands weren't fidgeting. He wasn't avoiding eye contact like most young offenders. Malik Carter wasn't nervous. Before Harrington could dwell on it, Malik's defense attorney, a public defender named Lisa Torres, slowly rose to her feet. She was young, clearly overworked, and had barely glanced at Malik since she walked in. "Your Honor," she began, "my client." But before she could continue, Malik gently placed a hand on her arm, signaling her to stop. She hesitated, looking at him in confusion. Malik turned to the judge and spoke for the first time. "I'd like to represent myself, Your Honor." The entire courtroom went silent. Judge Harrington's eyebrows lifted slightly. Gates, the prosecutor, let out a soft scoff. Harrington folded his hands together. "You'll what?" he asked, his voice carrying the same dry amusement he reserved for arrogant defendants. "I will represent myself," Malik repeated, his voice steady. "I have the right to do so." The spectators whispered among themselves. Gates chuckled under his breath. "This should be interesting," he muttered. Judge Harrington leaned back, intrigued. He had seen self-represented defendants before, but they were almost always disasters, rambling, confused, or hopelessly outmatched. This kid, however, seemed too calm, too sure. "Are you certain, Mr. Reed?" Harrington asked, giving the young man one last chance to reconsider. "Public defenders may be overworked, but I assure you, they are trained professionals." "I'm certain," Malik said simply. Lisa Torres hesitated, then sat back down, clearly relieved. Judge Harrington tapped his gavel lightly. "Very well. Mr. Reed, you may proceed with your defense." Malik nodded and turned toward the prosecution's table, his expression unreadable. The weight of the entire courtroom settled around him. He wasn't a lawyer, but he had spent years preparing for this moment. What neither the judge, nor the prosecutor, nor the spectators knew was that Malik Carter had studied the legal system since he was a child, and they were about to find out exactly why. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Malik Carter squared his shoulders and stepped forward. He could feel the weight of every gaze on him. Judge Harrington, who still seemed mildly amused, Prosecutor Leonard Gates, who wore a smirk of absolute certainty, and the jury, a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Malik's mind raced through every case he had studied, every courtroom drama he had observed, and every trick he had seen prosecutors use to bury defendants. But this wasn't just a game to him. This was his life. He turned to Gates. "Before we continue, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution." Gates raised an eyebrow, folding his arms across his chest. "Go ahead." Malik took a slow step toward the prosecution's table. "You said Officer Travis Moore witnessed me behind the wheel of the stolen vehicle before I was arrested, correct?" Gates exhaled sharply, already bored. "That's correct." "And his statement is in the official police report?" "Obviously." Malik nodded, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss Officer Moore's testimony as evidence." Judge Harrington's expression flickered with surprise. "On what grounds?" Malik pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time, gesturing toward the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Moore never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." A murmur rippled through the spectators. Gates frowned. "What are you talking about?" Malik turned back to the judge, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Your Honor, if the court allows, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Moore's GPS logs from that night. If his report states that he personally saw me in the vehicle, then his location history should confirm he was at the scene." Judge Harrington narrowed his eyes. It was a smart move, but it wasn't just smart, it was calculated. Because Malik already knew the truth. The officer hadn't been there. Gates cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. "That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional?" Malik shrugged slightly. "If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't," he let the words hang in the air. Judge Harrington's gaze flicked toward Gates. "Counselor, does the prosecution have any objections to verifying the officer's GPS logs?" A long, pregnant pause followed. The jury noticed, the spectators noticed, and most importantly, the judge noticed. Malik had spent years studying trials, observing how prosecutors played the system, and one thing was always true. If a prosecutor was confident in their case, they wouldn't stall. Gates adjusted his tie, his smirk faltering for the first time. Then, finally, he muttered, "No objections, Your Honor." Judge Harrington nodded, motion granted. Malik let out a slow breath. Step 1, create doubt. But he wasn't done. Gates shuffled his papers, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Your Honor," he said, his voice tightening, "while we wait for the GPS records, let's not forget the facts. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. That alone is enough evidence to convict." Malik nodded, as if considering the argument. Then he took a slow step forward. "That's true," he admitted, his voice controlled. "But let's talk about that evidence for a second." Judge Harrington gestured for him to continue. Malik turned to the jury, his dark eyes locking onto each one of them. "The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in the car means I stole it. That's the story they're selling. But let's think about this logically." He took a deep breath. Imagine you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then put it back on the rack. A few hours later, someone steals that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it? The jury exchanged glances. In the gallery, someone murmured under their breath. Malik pressed on. "The car in question was parked outside a gas station hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with my friends. And yes, When we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked." His voice remained steady. "I didn't think much of it. I didn't take the car. I didn't drive it. I didn't steal anything from inside. Just a dumb moment of curiosity." Malik let that sit for a moment, then delivered the final blow. "Does touching something make you a criminal?" The silence was deafening. Gates cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, searching for anything to regain control. But Malik wasn't finished. "And while we're on the topic of evidence," Malik continued, turning back to the judge, "let's talk about how this fingerprint analysis was done." Judge Harrington raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Malik tilted his head slightly. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist who examined the prints subpoenaed to testify?" Harrington blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Gates, who hesitated. Then, reluctantly, Gates muttered, "No." Malik nodded slowly, like that was all he needed to hear. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice as sharp as a blade. "The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence?" The jury stiffened. "No chance for me to cross-examine? No way to ask about the chain of custody? No opportunity to challenge the accuracy of the analysis?" Gates's jaw clenched. Malik nodded again. "Interesting." Judge Harrington let out a slow breath, pinching the bridge of his nose. The case was starting to unravel, and Malik wasn't done yet. Malik reached into his folder and pulled out a single piece of paper. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle." Judge Harrington frowned. "The owner?" "Yes," Malik said, stepping closer to the judge's bench. "Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the Lexus. He provided a statement to the police the night his car was reported stolen." He glanced at Gates, "And I think I know why the prosecution didn't mention it." Gates's face turned pale. Malik didn't wait for a response. Instead, he lifted the paper and read aloud. "I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Malik held up the document. "This is from the original police report, the same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned." He turned back to the jury. "The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the same general area and decided that was close enough." Malik let the silence stretch, let the weight of his words sink in. Then, finally, he turned back to the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice unwavering, "I move for an immediate dismissal." The room erupted. Judge Harrington gripped his gavel tighter than ever. For the first time in his career, he wasn't so sure what justice really meant. The weight of silence pressed down on the courtroom like a storm waiting to break. Judge Harrington remained motionless, his fingers gripping the edge of his bench, his gaze flickering between Malik and the visibly shaken prosecutor Leonard Gates. Gates's confidence had drained away like water through a sieve. He no longer wore the smug expression of a man convinced of his own victory. Instead, he was fumbling through his stack of papers, searching for a lifeline. But there wasn't one. The room had turned against him. Malik stood tall, unwavering. His hands were steady, his breathing even. He had studied this moment 1,000 times in his mind, and now it was real. Gates cleared his throat, trying to salvage what remained of his case. "Your Honor," he began, his voice weaker than before, I'd like to remind the court that the defendant was found near the abandoned vehicle. That proximity alone raises serious." Malik cut in smoothly. "Proximity?" He let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Your Honor, if standing near a crime scene makes you guilty, then every person who's ever walked past a crime should be arrested." A murmur of agreement swept through the spectators. Judge Harrington leaned forward, rubbing his temple. He had clearly underestimated Malik. This case, Malik continued, turning toward the jury, is built on assumptions. The assumption that my presence near the scene made me guilty. The assumption that because I'm young and black, I must have stolen the car. The assumption that the system is too strong for someone like me to fight back. His voice was calm, but his words cut deep. The only thing the prosecution has proven today is that they never had a case to begin with. The jury members exchanged glances. They were listening now, really listening. Gates was running out of options. He adjusted his tie, then tried to fall back on what prosecutors always did when they were losing: discredit the defendant. So, let me get this straight, Gates said, forcing a smirk. We're supposed to believe that this is all one big misunderstanding? That you, a kid from a rough neighborhood, just happened to touch the stolen car for no reason? Malik's expression remained neutral, but inside he felt the sting. He knew exactly what Gates was implying. He knew how people like him were viewed. But instead of letting it shake him, he smiled. "You're right, Mr. Gates," he said, his voice smooth. "I am from a rough neighborhood. I've seen kids get arrested for things they didn't do. I've seen kids get convicted based on nothing more than a prosecutor's hunch." His smile faded. "But what you're forgetting," he continued, his voice hardening, "is that I also learned how to fight back." The words hit like a hammer. Gates looked away, flustered. Malik turned back to the jury, delivering his final blow. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice steady. "This is about every person who has ever been told that their truth doesn't matter." Judge Harrington exhaled loudly, rubbing his temples. Finally, he straightened and turned toward Gates. "Mr. Gates," he said, his tone firm, "do you have any further evidence to present?" Gates hesitated. He knew there was nothing left to say. "No, Your Honor," he muttered. The room held its breath. Judge Harrington nodded once, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he spoke the words that would change everything. "Case dismissed." For a moment, the courtroom froze. Then, chaos erupted. Some gasped, others murmured in shock. The reporters in the back of the room scrambled to take notes. Malik didn't move. He had won. But as he looked over at Judge Harrington, he saw something unexpected. Not anger, not frustration, but something closer to regret. As if the judge had just realized that this wasn't just another case, that this wasn't just another kid, that he had almost sentenced an innocent man because the system had told him to. Judge Harrington cleared his throat, glancing toward Malik. "You should consider law school," he muttered. Malik smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. The walk out of the courthouse felt surreal. Malik had been prepared for a conviction. He had been prepared to fight even from behind bars. But now, he was free. Outside, reporters swarmed the steps, microphones thrust toward him. "Malik, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor?" Malik ignored them all. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. This was about something bigger. At the bottom of the steps, his mother Denise stood waiting. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then, finally, she let out a breath and pulled him into a tight hug. "Boy," she muttered, her voice shaking, "you scared me half to death." Malik chuckled, scratching the back of his head. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She pulled back, studying his face. "You always were the stubborn one." He grinned. Behind them, reporters were still shouting, "You're Hadford." But he wasn't listening anymore. Across the street, standing by his car, Judge Harrington watched. His posture was different now. The arrogance was gone. His expression wasn't amused anymore. It was something closer to reflection. Because he hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine. Another day, another defendant, another guilty plea. But now, he knew he would remember this one. Because Malik had done something most people never could. He made the system look at itself, and for once, it blinked first. The buzz inside the courthouse had not faded. even as Malik and his mother walked toward the parking lot. Reporters swarmed, their microphones thrust toward him like weapons, demanding a statement, a soundbite, a reaction. "Malik, did you expect this outcome? Do you think the judge was biased? Will you take legal action against the city?" Malik didn't stop. His mother tightened her grip on his arm. She knew the game. She had seen how the media twisted stories, and she wasn't about to let them turn her son's victory into a spectacle. But Malik wasn't afraid. He turned suddenly, facing the cameras head-on. "I don't have much to say," he started, his voice calm but full of meaning. "But I will say this. If I hadn't known my rights, if I hadn't fought back, I'd be in prison right now. And how many others never got the chance to fight?" The question hung in the air. Even the most persistent reporters fell silent, because they knew the answer. Malik let that silence sit for a moment longer, then turned and walked away. Back inside the courthouse, the legal world was reeling. The district attorney's office had never been embarrassed like this before. A 19-year-old defendant had single-handedly dismantled a case built by seasoned prosecutors in front of the entire city. And now people were asking questions. How did this case make it to trial? Why did the prosecution ignore key evidence? Was this just another example of the system railroading innocent defendants? Judge Harrington sat in his chambers, staring at the piles of case files on his desk. For the first time in a long time, he felt sick. He had always told himself that he was fair, that he simply followed the law. But today, he had come dangerously close to ruining an innocent young man's life. Not because the evidence was there, but because the system made it easy. And if Malik hadn't been so prepared, he would have been just another name, another statistic. The realization weighed on him. How many others had he failed? A knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. His assistant peered inside. "Sir," she hesitated. "There are people from the DA's office here. They want to discuss the case." Harrington exhaled deeply. He already knew what this was about. Damage control. The system wasn't designed to admit mistakes. It was designed to cover them up. But this time, the cover-up wasn't going to work. Because Malik Reed had exposed everything. While the justice system scrambled to save face, Malik sat at his mother's kitchen table, staring at an envelope in his hands. It was from the University of Southern California's law program. He had applied months ago, long before the arrest, long before he realized just how deep the cracks in the system ran. He had been waiting for this letter, waiting to know if his dream of becoming a lawyer was still possible. His mother sat across from him, her hands folded neatly, but her eyes betraying her nerves. "Well," she said, nudging his hand, "open it already." Malik took a deep breath, tore the envelope open, and unfolded the letter. As he read, his lips slowly curled into a smile. His mother leaned forward, searching his face. "Well," Malik set the letter down, looking her in the eye. "I got in, Ma." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled wide, nodding like she had known all along. "I never had a doubt." But Malik had doubted. He had wondered if the system would let someone like him succeed, if it would let him in. Now he realized something. He didn't need permission, because he wasn't just getting in, he was going to change it from the inside. Meanwhile, in the Los Angeles County District Attorney's office, a storm was brewing. The case dismissal hadn't just been an embarrassment, it had turned into a national story. Major news outlets were running headlines. Teen defendant exposes flaws in criminal justice system. Prosecutor caught hiding evidence in Grand Theft Auto case. Judge nearly convicts innocent teen without proof. And the worst part, the public wasn't forgetting. Under pressure, the DA's office launched an internal investigation. Prosecutor Leonard Gates was forced to resign. The arresting officers were placed under review. And Judge Harrington? He announced new judicial reforms, vowing to never let another innocent person slip through the cracks again. Would it be enough? Malik wasn't sure, but at least the world was watching now. At least they couldn't pretend this never happened. Months passed, but the case that changed everything refused to fade into history. Malik was no longer just a defendant who had beaten the system. He had become a symbol of something larger. His story had spread far beyond Los Angeles. Activists, lawyers, and everyday people cited his case as proof that the justice system was broken. Not in an abstract way, but in a way that ruined real lives. Colleges invited him to speak on criminal justice reform. Podcasts and news stations wanted his take. Even sitting judges reached out, wanting to know how they could avoid making the same mistake. Malik, once just another black teenager the system had tried to discard, was now shaping the conversation. And he wasn't done yet. Malik sat in his first law school lecture, surrounded by students who had never fought for their own freedom the way he had. Most of them were here because they believed in the law. Malik was here because he knew its flaws, because he had nearly been crushed by them. His professor, a stern-looking man in a navy suit, paced the front of the room. "Let's begin," he said, tapping the board. "I want to pose a question. Does the legal system protect the innocent or just the powerful?" A few students shifted uncomfortably. Some murmured. Malik leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. He had spent years preparing for this moment. And this time, he wouldn't be defending himself. He'd be fighting for others. Meanwhile, in the halls of power, conversations were changing. Malik's case had set off a chain reaction. Local policymakers pushed for more oversight on police arrests and prosecutorial discretion. Activist groups used his story to demand reforms in how public defenders were assigned. Even Judge Harrington, once so certain of his authority, had begun mentoring newer, more open-minded judges. The pressure to change was growing, because Malik had done something the system couldn't ignore. He had made the entire country watch as it nearly condemned an innocent man. And they weren't looking away. One day, Malik received a surprising invitation. Judge Harrington wanted to meet him. At first, Malik considered turning it down. What could they possibly have to say to each other? But something in him needed to know, so he agreed. They met in a quiet cafe, far from the courthouse. Harrington, looking older than Malik remembered, folded his hands on the table. "I owe you an apology," he said. Malik said nothing, letting him continue. "I was arrogant," Harrington admitted. "I assumed I knew everything I needed to, and because of that, I almost failed you." Malik exhaled slowly. He hadn't expected this. Harrington looked him in the eye. "I don't expect forgiveness," he continued, "but I do want to ask, what made you so prepared?" Malik thought about that for a moment. "My mother," he finally said. "She always told me that if I didn't know my rights, no one else would protect them for me." Harrington nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "I want to do better," the judge admitted, "and I think you'll make one hell of a lawyer." Malik smiled, but there was something more behind it. "Not just a lawyer," he said. "I plan to change this system for everyone it left behind." Harrington let out a slow breath, then nodded. "I believe you will." Malik walked out of that cafe feeling lighter than he had in months. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just reacting to the system. He was shaping it. He had taken the worst moment of his life and turned it into fuel for something bigger than himself. And this was only the beginning. Because the next time he walked into a courtroom, it wouldn't be as a defendant. It would be as the man standing up for the ones who never got the chance to fight back. And the system, it would never see him coming. What is lesson here? 1. Knowledge is power. Malik didn't have wealth or influence, but he had something just as powerful: knowledge. Education, whether formal or self-taught, can be the difference between being a victim of the system and overcoming it. 2. Question everything. Just because someone in authority says something is true doesn't mean it is. Malik exposed the flaws in the prosecution's case simply by asking the right questions. In life, don't accept everything at face value. Seek the truth for yourself. 3. Confidence can change the game. Malik walked into that courtroom with the confidence of a lawyer, not a scared teenager. The way we carry ourselves can determine how others see and treat us. When you believe in yourself, others will take notice. 4. The system isn't always just, but it can be challenged. This story highlights the flaws in the legal system, where assumptions and biases often dictate outcomes. However, change starts when people like Malik challenge the status quo. 5. Stand up for yourself. Even when the odds seem impossible, fighting for what's right is worth it. Malik could have accepted a plea deal, but he knew his truth and stood by it. His courage reminds us to never let fear silence us. What did this story teach you? Comment below and let's start the conversation.